Good morning again, everyone. Now let's begin our first session of the two-day national seminar on reflections on constitutional morality in India, past, present, and future. So session one is on the topic Evolution of Constitutional Morality, a historical reading. And to speak on this, we have one of the most eminent political theorists in India, Dr. Neera Chandhoke. She is a distinguished fellow at the Center for Equity Studies, New Delhi. And prior to this, she was professor of political science at University of Delhi and director of Developing Countries Research Center at the University of Delhi. Her recent publications include Rethinking Pluralism, Secularism, Tolerance, Anxieties of Coexistence, Democracy and Revolutionary Politics, and Contested Secessions. And her latest work is on Violence in Our Bonds. So welcome, Dr. Chandhoke, to the Today National
Thank
Seminar.
you.
And also to chair the session, we have Dr. Josuti. He's an associate professor at the Department of Political Science, University of Kerala. So welcome, sir. Over to you, Dr. Josuti.
Yeah, thank you, Rukmini. First of all, let me welcome Professor Neera Chandhoke. We are all very eager to listen to you. So I won't want to take much time and stand between you and the audience. So what I would like to say in the beginning is that, apart from the substantive content of constitutional morality, we are at a particular point of time when the constitutional obligation of the political actors to follow some ethical practices when it is required is largely missing. So our constitution itself is in a kind of or a kind of kept in a kind of quarantine. Certain aspects of the constitution by the political leadership is what we feel, to put it in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we need to work together to get connected back to the constitution, to the spirit of the constitution, to the values of the constitution. So we have a real practice. See, Ambedkar himself said in the beginning that it is not something that is fixed. It is a constitutional morality is not something that is quite natural. We need to learn it. We need to historically evolve it. Unfortunately, that part is missing. So this is where I think the talk by Professor Neera Chandhoke is quite significant. Ma'am, with all gratitude and anxiety, we welcome you. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And I'm talking to you from a very cold and miserable Delhi. We haven't seen the sun for 3 days. And I notice all of you are, none of you are wearing woolens. So maybe we'll generate some warmth. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. Always a pleasure to be with young colleagues and students of political science. Now, what I want to do in this 40-minute presentation is to really talk about the historical antecedents of the Constitution, not in terms of the Government of India Acts, which are, of course, an important part of our constitutional history, but in terms of nationalist initiatives to chart out a constitution for an India that would become independent in the future. This is quite rare, actually, to have a freedom struggle overlap with the movement for the constitutional development of the country. And of course, it may be a derivative discourse, as Partha Chatterjee has suggested. But I was thinking the other day, if you go back to the turn of the 20th century, the kinds of initiatives that came onto the political platform, came onto public attention. And these were not only the Indian National Congress, though I will be concentrating on the Congress more. These were also private individuals who wrote entire books about rights. So the other day when I was looking at Madhav Khosla's excellent book on India's constitution, the founding moment, I was a little stunned to read that he thinks that liberalism kind of emanated from the Constituent Assembly. It didn't. It has a long provenance. It dovetails into our constitutional history and to the history of the freedom struggle. So in a way, the leaders of the national movement not only talked about independence, they also had a blueprint of what India would become after independence. And I think now that Republic Day is around the corner, we ought to respect that. We ought to really salute them as very far-thinking and as very as leaders who were committed to the transformation of India. Just one more introductory remark. You know, when I was young, a long time ago, most of us were radicals, were left in that sense of the term, and many of us rejected the Indian constitution as a bourgeois constitution. This was also because Indian constitution was not taught in particularly imaginative ways when I did my BA and my MA in political science in Delhi University. I remember when I got a job immediately after MA, and I was hardly 21, and then I was saddled with the task of teaching constitutional history to first-year students of Lady Shriram College, my own college. And we taught from Guru, I think the author was Guru Mukh Nihal Singh, and he wrote the most boring book on the books on the evolution of the constitution, or indeed on colonialism. It was only when Professor Randhir Singh took over as the head of the department in 1973 that suddenly political science went through a transformation. So I devoutly hope that my presentation today is not seen by young people as boring. I try not to make it so. Right, now the Indian constitution, which is of course one of the largest in the world, is generally seen as a lawyer's paradise. You know, many a legal battle, an important legal battle, has been fought over each provision of the Constitution. I mean, careers have been made and careers have been wrecked. And our constitutional history is very largely the history of what Supreme Court directions on what the Constitution consists of. A great deal of jurisprudence has been generated in the course of defending the Constitution or attacking it, adding to the Constitution, detracting from it. But generally it is seen as a lawyer's paradise. I think the idea that the Constitution is a deeply political document, it's one of the signposts of India's democratic polity, was made clear in the anti-CAA agitations of 2019-2020. When we saw these thousands of young people out on the streets, first of Delhi and then over the rest of India, armed with the Constitution. And when they spoke with the background of Ambedkar, Gandhi and Bhagat Singh. And they only said something, give us our Constitution. And they were openly reading the Constitution. They were reading it in public, and particularly the preamble. And never have I seen the Constitution being such a deeply political document as our young people showed us that it could be. What they were not asking for revolution. They were not asking for social all that they were saying is, we have a Constitution, give us our Constitution, and down with this anti-CAA bill. Now, as far as social movements go, I think it's one of the most significant social movements in India. It was spontaneous, it was passionate, and it gave you actually very concrete pillars of our democracy, to see it as that without a constitution, a democracy is nothing. We have to see that the judicialization of the Constitution, I remember from the first books we read was Piley's Indian Constitution, was the judicialization of the Constitution, seeing it as purely in legal terms, has probably obfuscated the deeply political nature of our document. We forget that initiatives to create a Constitution of India go back to 1895. By the 1920s, the freedom struggle was transformed under the genius of Gandhi into a mass movement. And the concept of freedom, you know, when you had the notion of freedom, it was cast in the liberal mold. It was smote in stone. quintessentially liberal notions of fundamental rights, rule of law, parliamentary democracy, and universal adult franchise. It is true that the administrative structure of the Constitution is based upon the 1935 Government of India Act. And nobody less than Ambedkar acknowledged it when he said, yes, we have taken from the 1935 Act. But there are at least three aspects of the Constitution which actually go back to nationalist initiatives. The preamble. The British were not keen on rights. I mean, the only time they recognized rights was in the Cabinet Mission Plan, when they sent the Cabinet Mission Plan. The Fundamental Rights chapter, that is chapter 3 of the Constitution, and chapter 4, Directive Principles of State Policy. Now, directive principles have been taken from Ireland, but the content of these directive principles, that is social and economic rights, were again a demand that go back to the first decades of the 20th century. More significantly, and this is something that I want to emphasize, the leaders of the national movement insisted that Indians will write their own constitution. This was not going to be a gift of the colonial government. This was not going to be written sitting in London. It would be written by Indians themselves who had been part of this great transformation, which sought to create citizens out of subjects. And thirdly, what I want to say is that every precept of the Constitution that we see today was the result of a political compromise. It was not thought of in wood-paneled rooms where the intellectuals sat and designed a constitution. And in the next half an hour or so, I really want to concentrate on this aspect. The other aspect that we have to appreciate is that the Constituent Assembly met on 9th December 1946 during extraordinarily turbulent times. On practically the eve of the meeting, I mean, right up till August, India was marked by student, worker, and peasant uprisings. In July of the same year, postal services were dislocated in Bombay and in Delhi, and other provinces were affected. And Jawaharlal Nehru, in an editorial of the Hindustan Times of 12th July 1946, it cited Jawaharlal Nehru as saying that all these trade unions should accept arbitration. They said, we are trying to create a constitution. Please now give us an atmosphere where we can do so without unnecessary acrimony. And then Nehru goes on to say, and remember, Nehru was a Fabian socialist. He had, great confidence in agitational methods, that in labor disputes generally, and more particularly in regard to essential services, civilized government and society provide other means of settlement than the strike. It's a very unusual statement for Nehru to make, but you suddenly realize that the leaders of our freedom struggle are going to become the rulers of a future of an independent India. Now, massive unrest peaked. If you look at the volume on Towards Freedom, edited by Sumit Sarkar, 1946, you will see the extent of discontent. Railways were affected, post offices were affected, trade unions, mining, they were all affected. And then, of course, the police was also affected, and then the naval ratings went on strike. And then, says Sumit Sarkar, after August 1946, communal rights took over. So we had the great Calcutta killings in 1946, and this was the eve of the meeting of the Indian Constituent Assembly. Why I make this point is very simply this. It would have been very easy for the makers of the Constitution to say that India is up in arms, from communal riots to strikes, everybody is in ferment. We need a very strong state without fundamental liberties. But this was not what they said. Secondly, when the Constituent Assembly met in December 1946, 9th December, and Nehru outlines his objectives resolution, the hope was that the Muslim League would join the deliberations of the Constituent Assembly. There were 88 seats put aside we all know the Constituent Assembly was indirectly elected out of the provincial assemblies. There were 88 seats set aside for the Muslim League. The Muslim League did not join in December, and the discussion on the objectives resolution was postponed till January 1947 so that it could join. But by January 1947, partition was clearly on the horizon, and Jinnah refused to join. In August 19, and still that was the time in January 1947 that the debate on the objectives resolution took place. In August 1947, India is partitioned. 1 million people died. 500,000 died in India, Punjab alone. This is Indian Punjab. We still do not know how many people died, what became Pakistani Punjab. Shortly after the partition of India in August, October 1947, the Kashmir problem arose on the horizon, and the Indian Army had to go to war with Pakistan. In January 1948, Mahatma Gandhi is assassinated, and India is left rudderless without a man who had given the country an idea of how politics and ethics could be integrated, and who had mobilized millions of Indians into a major struggle. And then, of course, there were agrarian revolts, and there were communal riots, great deal of bloodshed. And against this background, our democratic constitution was created. In a way, the idea that the constitution is a foreign import, it is alien. You know, we hear again and again that we hope to hear the strings of the sitar. What we have got are strings of the violin. I mean, this is completely unwarranted, because in a way, the Indian constitution was drafted against a background of tremendous upheaval, and partition of territory is not an easy a matter. Mass massacres are not an easy matter for the makers of the constitution to come to terms with. They held fast to two things: A, minority rights, and B, fundamental rights. Now, howsoever flawed be these fundamental rights, and they have been compromised more than the makers of the constitution intended by governments of independent India, the idea that people would possess absolute fundamental rights subject to certain provisions was really one of the contributions of the makers of the constitution that we ought to cherish. Now, how did the constitutional idea emerge? In 1895, a constitution, a bill for India, emerged onto public attention. And it was this that Pandit Nehru, when he introduced the Objectives Resolution on the 9th of December 1946, said. He said, the meeting of the Constituent Assembly is not a gift of the colonial government. It was the outcome of a number of initiatives taken by individuals and by members of the Indian National Congress. And they conceptualized the fundamental principles of the polity again and time and again. And I quote, "For a long time, we have been having various plans for a free India in our minds, but now we are beginning the actual work. I hope you will be at one with me when I say that we should present a clear plan of this to ourselves, to the people of India, and to the world." Close quotes. In 1895, when the Constitution of India bill came to public attention, nobody really knew who had authored this bill. But Annie Besant said that it was probably authored by Bal Gangadhar Tilak, by Lokmanya Tilak. Now, in 1895, please remember, it focalized civil rights, the right of liberty, the right of freedom of expression, the right to freedom of life and property. And at the same, of course, they did not conceptualize independence in 1895. India should be a part of the British Empire. But the idea of civil liberties, which had been problematized again once today, these days, when people, people are in danger of losing their life and their freedom of expression. It is important to remember one of the most important rights was civil liberties, particularly the right to freedom. By 1924, 43 distinguished Indians across the political spectrum signed a memorandum. This memorandum was attached to a bill for a constitution, for a constitutional draft, that a constitution should be given to India by the British government. It still did not envisage self-authorship. By 1924, slowly, the prominent Indians, and particularly these Indians, nationalist leaders, 43 distinguished leaders, signed a memorandum which accompanied the Commonwealth of India Bill 1925 to the British Parliament. The bill was sent to the Labour government in England. The bill, titled A Bill to Constitute Within the British Empire Commonwealth of India, was carefully revised by prominent members of the Labour Party, and the Labour Party was always sympathetic to the idea of freedom of India. It also had its first reading in the House of Commons, but then the Labour Party was defeated at the polls, and the bill kind of died a natural death, did not come to fruition. The bill stated that India had a right to self-government and that it should be put on an equal footing with Australia and Canada, that is self-governing dominions. A fuller version of a draft constitution was written in 1928. Now, slightly to give a background to this draft constitution, the Simon Commission had come to India to look at constitutional development, and the Simon Commission did not contain a single Indian representative, though very notable Indians were lawyers. They were very, very prominent lawyers, and they had made their mark. Not a single Indian was represented in the Simon Commission. Now, that was a time when major mobilization happened across the country. Wherever the Simon Commission went, it was met by black flags. In fact, in Lahore, Lala Lajpat Rai died because of attack by the police, by lathis. He was protesting against the Simon Commission. There was major discontent. Incidentally, in the Simon Commission, apart from the distinguished lawyer Sir John Simon, Clement Attlee, who later became the Prime Minister of India, was also heading the Simon Commission. At that point, the Secretary of State for India in England was Lord Birkenhead. He challenged Indian leaders, show me that you can draw up a constitution which is acceptable to all parts of your society. See, the 1920s, we have to recognize, if 1920s saw an acceleration of the freedom struggle, it also saw an acceleration of communal rioting. Some of the worst communal riots took place in the 1920s because by that time, fundamentalist organizations had made their appearance onto the stage of Indian politics. And of course, there was a very, very big communal riot in Kanpur in 1931. Now, he said, show me that you can make a constitution that can fetch the approval of the Muslim community and of the Hindus. I mean, he was being sarcastic, he was being nasty, but the Congress leadership took up the challenge. In 1927, in Madras, at the Madras meeting, the INC suggested that there should be an all-parties meeting which would draft the constitution. And it would draft it in a way that all members were associated. An all-parties conference met under the leadership of M.A. Ansari to devise a constitutional framework for an independent in India. On 19th May 1928, they constituted a committee headed by Motilal Nehru, and now we know it as a Motilal Nehru draft. There were two things that were of central importance that we have to understand as being utterly politically sophisticated. That was the same time when in Ceylon in 1928, the Ceylonese constitution, it was Ceylon then, had envisaged no universal adult franchise because women were not allowed to vote till they were 30. Men could vote at 21. The first thing the Motilal Nehru constitutional draft gave to the people was universal adult franchise. And they made it very clear, we know the people of India are illiterate, but illiteracy is no bar to the exercise of the vote. And we hope that by participation in political affairs and in democratic affairs, people will learn political wisdom. So women also had the vote equivalent to men at the age of 21. The second was that the All-Party Commission had gone to the Muslim League and said, join us. And the Muslim League had said, we want separate electorates. The Indian National Congress leaders were against the very idea of separate electorates, and they rejected the idea of a separate electorate, but they did accept what they call minority rights. Now you have to imagine the generosity of the leaders, the farsightedness of the leaders and the authors to the Motilal Nehru constitutional draft. They gave to the minorities minority rights, which were to become Article 29 and 30 in the Constitution of India. The Constitution of India did not accept secularism till, of course, in the emergency regime put it in, but they accepted minority rights to their culture, their language, their educational institution, to their religion. And Article 25, that everybody should have the right to their religion. 10 of these fundamental rights drafted in the 1928 constitutional draft were embodied in the 1950 Constitution of India. Granville Austin says that 3 of these provisions were made a part of the directive principles of state policy. Very importantly, the leaders of the the Motilal Nehru draft said, open quotes, unlike Ceylon, we do not propose to put any restriction on the right of women to vote, which does not equally apply to men. We attach no weight to the objections based on the prevailing illiteracy of the masses and their lack of political experience. Political experience can only be acquired by active participation in political institutions and does not entirely depend on literacy. I would urge you to remember that in England, all women got the vote only in 1928. They were given votes in stages, and women had to fight several battles for universal adult franchise to get the right to vote. France, which had the first bourgeois revolution, 1789, did not give women the right to vote. French women only got the right to vote in the first decades of the 20th century. We have to understand that, in a way, the Indian constitutional draft of 1929 was a trailblazer. It showed the rest of the world that it doesn't matter, because a number of voices came up and continued to come up that India lacked all the preconditions for a democracy. It was not literate. It did not have wealth. There was no economic productivity, and above all, that Indians were divided on caste and on religion. There was no civicness. And in this condition, to give the universal, we don't tend to, we take the vote for granted, but when we remember that in the rest of the world, women had to fight for the vote, we have to really acknowledge the 28 draft for laying down that everybody has a right to vote, irrespective of literacy, of property, or of educational qualifications, which was the case in the Government of India Acts. Now, on the aftermath of the Kanpur riots, the Congress held a session in 1931 in Karachi. The Karachi Resolution on Fundamental Rights was passed, and Gandhi himself said that in a country like ours, the state will be neutral towards all religions. The first definition of secularism was stated by Gandhi. So the fundamental principles of a constitution for independent India: universal adult franchise, civil liberties, the right to education, which comes up in 1924, health, well-being, and minority rights were thought of as staple features of the Indian Constitution. The second remarkable feature of the Constitution, of our constitutional history, is that unlike other colonies, Indians insisted that they themselves should write the Constitution. Of course, India had very, very distinguished lawyers who had studied often in England. In 1934, the Indian National Congress demanded a constituent assembly and rejected the 1933 bill, the draft, the mission report. Nehru, in piece on why write our own constitution, said, it means we're walking out and away from the economic foundations and structures of imperialism. This cannot be done by the wisest of lawyers sitting together in a conclave. It cannot be done by a small committee trying to balance interests and calling that constitution making. It can never be done under the shadow of an external authority. It can be done effectively when the urge and the sanction come from the masses. Hence, universal suffrage. Hence, self-ownership. They were very clear. India could own its constitution only when Indians had written the constitution and when the Constituent Assembly was elected on the basis of adult franchise. The second part did not happen. The Cabinet Mission Plan had come to effect a reconciliation between Hindus and Muslims. The Muslim League continued to insist for Pakistan, to demand Pakistan. And the Cabinet Commission was of the opinion that a Constituent Assembly should meet. But you could not have adult franchise, universal adult franchise. That would require too much time and too much investment. It would have taken years to create census rolls, to give people the right to vote. And we have to remember partition was hovering over the imaginations of Indians. Therefore, the Constituent Assembly met according to the Cabinet Mission formulation that the members of the Constituent Assembly would be elected by the provincial assemblies. However, Granville Austin would suggest that since the Congress itself was an umbrella organization, many historians have said the Congress was a coalition of big men. All the compromises, all the decisions were hammered out through debate and dialogue between big men. And this was the spirit that permeated the Constitution, and though it was certainly not based on adult franchise, in a way, a study of the Constituent Assembly debates makes it quite clear that they did so while representing the people of India. This was the constitutional history of India, and every constitution we need to recollect, embodies the spirit of its age. The 1789 Constitution of France embodied the revolutionary spirit. The Declaration of the Rights of Man, which were the rationale for the revolution, became a part of the Constitution. The American Constitution of 1787 it reflected in every paragraph the spirit of liberty. The US had fought a war against the colonial power, England. And in a way, every constitution is an embodiment of the historical age. But more importantly, our constitution was a design for the future. And this design was laid out by Dr. Ambedkar. His argument for constitutional morality and adopting constitutional morality as the paramount morality of the Constitution is interesting. So let me go briefly to his argument. On 4th November 1949, remember the constitution was being wrapped up. The draft was ready. The constitution was ready by the end of November 1949. And now we have discussions on the draft constitution in November 1949. On 4th November 1949, during the discussion of the draft constitution, Dr. Ambedkar answered the allegations that the Constitution of India was an alien import. He said a number of constitutions have been drafted across the modern world, and the 20th century was the era of constitution making. First, after the First World War, when empires broke up and people got their own governments. And each of these constitutions set a precedent for India's constitution. I quote, "The only new things," he said, "if there can be any in a constitution framed so late in the day, are the variations to remove the faults and to accommodate it to the needs of the country." As to the accusation that the draft constitution has produced a good part of the provisions of the Government of India Act 1935, I make no apologies. There's nothing to be ashamed of in borrowing. It involves no plagiarism. End quotes. He made it very clear that 1935 Act became the basis for the administrative structure of the Constitution. The constitutions normally don't have these details. They normally are about the objectives of the polity, what the Constitution hopes to achieve. These kind of administrative details that talked about center, state, about division of powers, about who would hold what power, was unusual. And it is here that Dr. Ambedkar makes the significant intervention. He says it is true detailed administrative provisions should not be included in the Constitution. It is necessary to protect democracy, because unless you have a rule of law, unless you have separation of powers, and unless you have division of powers between various governments, you are going to land up with aristocracy. I mean, the moment the governments become centralized, the state governments are subordinated to the center, everybody says this is a violation of the Constitution. He talks of this as constitutional morality. Now, Ambedkar's notion of constitutional morality comes from the British historian George Grote. I'm not very sure whether it is Grote or Grote, but it's Grote, who had done a 12-volume history of Greece, of Athens, of Athenian democracy. He's a 19th century historian, and Grote was taught in the history sections of whatever universities had come up in the 19th century. But Dr. Ambedkar seems to have become familiar with him when Dr. Ambedkar went to Columbia University. In 1846 to 1856, when Grote authored his 12 volumes of Greece, and more particularly of Athens, he tried to rescue Athenian democracy from its attackers, particularly Plato. Plato had no reverence for democracy. Grote focuses on Cleisthenes, the founder of Athenian democracy. And what was the contribution of Cleisthenes? George Grote says the contribution was that he replaced arbitrary decision-making by individuals or cabals or political parties or 3 or 4 leaders by decision-making according to a constitution. He replaces arbitrary decisions by a focus on decision-making established in the constitution. Every time the government makes a decision, it has to go through various procedures. From the various procedures involved in getting it from the legislature, from the administrative officers to the parliament, to the three readings, through discussion, and finally the Supreme Court. We, he said, must follow the Athenian notion of having passion for our constitution. Because in the constitution is laid down the framework that will prevent non-democracy, that will prevent centralization, that will prevent the control of power in one set of hands. Ambedkar, as also mentioned Groth's contribution to not only the understanding of Athenian democracy, but also two other instances where constitutional morality had succeeded over arbitrary decision making. The first instance is the Glorious Revolution of England, 1688, where James II was removed by the Parliament and replaced by his daughter Mary and her husband, William III, on the throne of England. And from there on, it was the Parliament that was supreme, not a monarch. The monarchy's wings were trimmed. The Glorious Revolution of 1688. And the second instance that Groth mentions was the making of the American Constitution. Because America was an immigrant society, it had no history to speak of, common history. They got together and said, what is our Bible? The Constitution. And that passion for the Constitution, that dedication to the Constitution, that following of constitutional morality is what Ambedkar called constitutional morality. Now, I just have an interesting anecdote. When the famous historian E.H. Carr wrote his comment on history writing, he said, you look at George Groth, he writes 12 volumes on Athenian democracy, and in not one of them is mentioned the fact that Athens practiced slavery. Not only that Athens didn't give vote to women, that Athens only gave vote to Athenian-born natural citizens. Aliens did not have the vote. So H. Carr said we must not glamorize the past. Learn to understand it. At the same time, when you look at the period in which Groth wrote, please remember slavery was not a crime in the earlier part of the 20th century. It was only later, of the 19th century. It was only later that it became a sin. It became something that had to be fought. Now, in a way, Groth did not mention the restricted franchise. He did not mention it was completely male-oriented, but he did say that constitutions have to be seen as the ultimate document which leads you to freedom. And there are two aspects of his constitutional morality that need to be noted. The first is freedom, the second is self-restraint. The government, the people who are in the government must be restrained. And then only can the freedom of the people be secured. Self-restraint is the precondition of freedom. Finally, the implications of constitutional morality, of Ambedkar's notion of constitutional morality, are striking. It is well known that he said with that, the Constitution is the topsoil of dressing on a very undemocratic society. He had experienced oppression, he had experienced discrimination. Being a leader of the Dalits, he knew that Indian society was hierarchical and oppressive and discriminatory. And on this society, you're imposing a constitution. The first thing we, the people of India, give to ourselves a constitution, equality, freedom, etc., etc. Now, how are you going to impose this on a people who are essentially undemocratic? I'm sorry, we continue to be undemocratic. In that way, constitutional morality has failed us, or we have failed constitutional morality. Now, Ambedkar said this democratic revolution can only happen not only because we have adopted a constitution. This can happen only if we see the constitution as superior to every other law, to our caste laws, to our laws of marriage, our laws of dining, our laws of, the various idiotic, irrational modes that kind of create a very divisive society. Caste is divisive. Religion and India had been partitioned. It was bound to be hate against the minorities. Now, in such a circumstance, the only document, the only provision that could hold India together as a democratic society was the Constitution. So the Constitution had to supervene. It had to be superior to every other code, every other norm that marked a very undemocratic society. The second aspect of constitutional morality is very interesting. And here Ambedkar actually shows himself as a very modern political scientist who's an outcome of the American system. All clashes, all conflicts, and all violations of your democracy have to be resolved within the framework of the Constitution and in accordance with the spirit of the Constitution. Now, please, what he is doing is, remember, India had got freedom through agitational means. From the 1920s onwards, when Gandhi had mobilized the people, Indians were always challenging the government, wasn't it? Whether it was civil disobedience or it was non-cooperation or it was quit India. On every law, on every act of the colonial government, India had been adopting agitational techniques, and that is normal for a colonial society. They did not accept it. But Ambedkar's argument is, now we have people of our own, we have a government of our own, we have a constitution of our own. Every clash must be resolved within the framework of the constitution. You can't look to Khap panchayats or you look to religious heads. No other authority stands above the constitution. No religious head, no document, no scripture, no identity stands above the constitution. So when these sadhus, so-called sadhus in the Dharam Sansad, that's Haridwar, call for genocide, they are performing an unconstitutional act. They should be brought before the bar of the Supreme Court because there is nothing above the constitution. And Ambedkar knew that unless you drilled this in the minds of an Indian who is completely governed by caste. I remember Nehru, who was an upper caste. I mean, Ambedkar we can understand because he was the victim of the caste system. And yet a man could give these kind of talks in the Constituent Assembly. It makes you tremble that what a great man he was. But Nehru, who was upper caste, Kashmiri Pandits are all Saraswat Brahmin, he writes in the Discovery of India, the Hindu will die observing the rules of his kitchen. The Muslim is a little more democratic, but even he has forgotten the egalitarian nature of his religion. So in a way, both Nehru and Ambedkar knew that Hindus are governed by their caste. Who to eat with, who not to eat with, what to eat, what not to eat. And this is ridiculous in a constitution. You cannot distinguish between people on the basis of their caste or subcaste. You have to be equal in the eyes of the law. And for that, you have to learn constitutional morality. If that is so, then there is no reason for caste rights or communal rights to take place. The adoption of the constitution and the transition from subject to citizen for Ambedkar meant the end of agitational politics. It's very actually surprising that he would rule out any kind of civil disobedience, because civil disobedience is allowed by everybody. John Rawls allows you civil disobedience. But his fear was that if you start going to extra constitutional bodies to clarify what your conflict is about and how it should be resolved, then the status of the constitution will be compromised. Now think of the social transformation this entailed. Since the 1920s, the Indian people had embarked on a major struggle for freedom. They challenged the colonial government on practically every policy. Now they had to transit from agitational politics to cooperative citizenship. They had to come together as citizens, not as freedom fighters. It's easier to get together in the cause of freedom, and Ambedkar realized it's more difficult to work together. Because half the time, I mean, even in radical movements, people are conscious of their caste, they're conscious of women, they're conscious of transgenders are given a bad deal in India. You know, so in a way, when you get together and try and create cooperative citizenship, then you have to forget agitational techniques. Every Indian had to accept that the authority of the constitution as was the embodiment of popular sovereignty. No religious power, no institution such as a church, no set of scriptures stand above the constitution. The transition is difficult, was to be difficult, but Ambedkar said, we have to work together. We have to work within the framework of the constitution if we want to realize democracy. And the final point is, you know, it's very odd, but Ambedkar was very skeptical of Satyagraha. He thought that Gandhi's Satyagraha was unnecessarily, it unnecessarily presented itself as superior wisdom. You know, Gandhi's Satyagraha, he had to go through a lot of discipline before he or she entered the public domain. They had to be spiritual, they had to fast, they had to observe celibacy. It was like going to the temple. 40 days, you observe these kind of restraints on your conduct. And when they entered the public sphere, then Gandhi's Satyagraha was the embodiment of virtue. He embodied the Indian people. To Ambedkar, this whole idea that one group of people in a democracy would claim superiority was completely undemocratic. So what Ambedkar believed in was pluralism, that every party to a conflict or to a partnership was equal. You know, it is a very democratic idea that you give no credence to someone who thinks he or she is superior merely by belonging to a superior caste, or merely because they are men, or merely because they are upper caste women. You sit down and engage with others in a spirit of equality and talk till you come to an agreement. And even if you don't come to an agreement, it doesn't matter. The idea of democracy as dialogue, which is basically what Ambedkar is talking about, of dialogue within the spirit of the constitution, means that you are engaged with each other. And forgive me, but it seems to me that the younger generation, we were conscious as the first generations of independent India of the need of our fellow citizens, because the first communal riot only happened in 1969 when the Congress system broke up. You have to be conscious, you have to engage with your co-citizens. Do not shun them because you think their ideas are stupid, or they belong to the wrong religion, or belong to the wrong caste. Learn to engage, because it is only then that you will see each other as equals. After all, we don't enter into conversations with people whom we don't regard as equal, isn't it? In a feudal society. I'm very conscious. I'm speaking to a university in Kerala, and Kerala has shown us what democracy is. But still, I'm afraid caste continues to dodge our heels. Religion continues to dodge our heels. No, Ambedkar didn't say all this. It is my understanding of Ambedkar that he embraced pluralism, that everybody is equal. But that would mean, and this is, I conclude, Grote had suggested, quote, the diffusion of constitutional morality not merely among the majority of any community, but throughout the whole, is the indispensable condition of government at once as free and peaceable. Even any powerful and obstinate minority might render, the working of a free institution impracticable without being strong to conquer ascendancy for themselves. And Ambedkar interprets growth this way. He meant constitutional morality is paramount reverence for the forms of the Constitution, enforcing obedience to authority acting under and within these forms, yet combined with the habit of open speech, of action subject only to definite legal control, and unrestrained censure of those very authorities as to all their public acts, combined too with the perfect confidence in the bosom of every citizen amidst the business of party contest, that the forms of the Constitution are no less sacred in the eyes of his opponent than his own. Simply speaking, what Ambedkar was saying is, guys, if you have to create a constitution, and if then you have to abide by a democratic constitution, then you have to abide by its provisions. But that would mean that the holders of power give you the confidence that they too hold the Constitution sacred. It's not only us. The holders of power hold the Constitution sacred, and the Supreme Court is there to safeguard any deviation from the Constitution. I'm saying this with great regret, but as Supreme Court in the recent past, not under the present Chief Justice, but in the recent past, has shown itself completely indifferent to the spirit of the Constitution. And I'm not talking about the morals of the Constitution, I'm talking about the morality of the Constitution when it comes to the civil liberties of the Indian people, when it comes to Kashmir, or indeed when it comes to Ayodhya. Now, when you are no longer confident that your executive, your government, and your judiciary also holds the Constitution sacred, then you're in for a rude shock. Then no constitution can work, but even a constitution that is as impeccably democratic as India's was. In that sense, constitutional morality is binding not only upon the citizens of India, but particularly upon the holders of power. Thank you.